Hi everyone, and welcome to this Relatics 6.10 release webinar. My name is Shilan and I'm joined today by Ruben, and as you can see we have a new location, so we are live today in our office in Ridderkerk. So as many of you know, today we'll be discussing the topic of libraries, and we know a lot of you are very excited, so we are very excited to dive into it. Before we do that, know that we'll be answering your questions live on the background, so feel free to ask them in your own language. All right, Ruben, libraries, please tell us more.
Sure. So at a basic level, libraries allow an organization to stand projects, similar projects more efficiently. And I really want to start with the theory behind libraries before we move into the practice. What libraries do is they enable an organization to ensure a certain consistency of the data and a certain quality for standardized data sets. It also allows to accelerate your project setup because you can use standardized data sets at the start of your project. What it also does is it allows you to build upon proven best practices and accumulated knowledge for those standardized data sets. But when we're working with libraries and when we're thinking about libraries, within these libraries there are two main types of data. And I want to explain to you what those two types are. So the first type is information that you want to reuse, or stencil as we call it, across projects. Normally this is information that you might use once but often use multiple times within the project. And you also might want to tailor or adjust that information to your specific project needs. But of course you don't have to reinvent the wheel yourself every time this data is used. Examples of this include standard inspections, standard risks, or maybe even a system breakdown structure. Now the second type of data is more information that is not stenciled multiple times in the project, but is unique for your project and only exists once within the workspace. This is data that you simply want to refer to. Examples of this include persons, maybe object types, maybe locations, or organizations, or even certain classifications. So this is not data that's created within the project, but more secondary data that's there to support your core engineering data on the project.
All right, so very theoretical, Ruben. I would say just dive into Relatics.
Yeah, sure. Of course, we don't want to bore you with all the concepts, so let's get started in Relatics. So I'll move into my Relatics environment. And we've added the ability for power users to differentiate between your core project elements and your more secondary or supporting reference elements. So I'll move into my example workspace. We'll move into this project called Reflex Delta Crossing. And of course I want to start in the graph view of this workspace. So we have a very basic system engineering model in place for this workspace. Apparently we are managing activities. These activities have a relation to a type, to typify our activities, and we have a relation to an object. And as you can see, we're already managing data on all three of these elements. What I want to do now is I want to expand this model with an element for person. And as I just stated with the explanation of reference elements, the person element is a good example of something that I would use or configure as a reference type element. So what I'll do is I'll go to my graph view and I'll create a new type element, and immediately we can see the distinction that is being made between a new project type element and a new reference type element. So as I stated, person is going to be a reference element, so we'll start with a new reference type element. We'll place it into our model. I'll just quickly create my element. Of course, select an icon and hit create. And we also want to create a relation between the element activity and the element person. So from activity, I'll create a new relation to the element person, and we'll call this relation the executor relation, as these persons are the executors, for that activity. And we'll keep the cardinality on multi because we want multiple executors per activity. Now I'll hit create, and immediately, as you can see, we see a visual distinction between our reference type elements and our project elements that were already in the workspace. The reference type element is a more gray icon instead of the colors for the central project elements. And we can see that the relation is more of a dotted line instead of that full line that the central project elements have. So this is a clear visual distinction for reference elements in our graph view. Right, so I'll need a few persons, of course, to relate to my information. I'll close the graph view right now, and I'll create some persons, just some example data, to help you identify how this feature works. Let's say 4 should be enough. So I have some persons in my workspace for the reference element person, and now I want to go to my activity and I want to relate a few persons to an activity. So I'll open a random activity and I'll go to the detail page, and once I arrive on that detail page, I'll zoom in a bit, you can see that the relation to person has actually been added to the general table of the detail page, indicating that this secondary metadata or supportive data is more a part of the element activity. And you have the ability to select those persons from the general table, and of course it was a multi-relation, so I can select multiple persons, and now I have some reference element persons linked to my activity. This not only goes for the detail page of my element activity. If I move over to the overview, and let's take a my view for example, but this also works for use cases, and I open my model selector for a my view page, I can simply click on the person name, and I can also visualize another relation to let you know what the visual distinction of these two elements really are. So we can see that the object relation, or a relation to a project element, has its own header and own column, but the person relation is really a part of that activity, just like you would look at a property, like the name of activity right here.
Yeah, so indeed, like you said, Ruben, this reference element is shown more as a property, both in the detail view as in the overview, as they often behave as contextual metadata. But can you still show them in a normal way as well, in a normal relation?
Yeah, of course. We can very well imagine that users might not want to have this information in the general table. So you have the ability to organize this yourself. For this, I'm going to move back to my workspace and open my graph view. We can head over to the organize model setting, in which you can rearrange your elements and your properties. And when I open my activity detail page, I can see that we have the name property right here and the relation to person as a part of the general table, indicated by the gray line. And the other relations are below. And I can simply click and drag the relation outside of the general table, hit update, and once I move back to my detail page, I can see that the relation to person got its own relation table. And when I move back to my overview, let's take the my view again as an example, we can see that persons now have their own dedicated column with their own header.
Right, I see. So let's go back a little bit, because for now the reference element you made yourself actually. But what if a project is already using a workspace, so they already have a model? Can they then still turn parts of that model into reference elements as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So we can of course imagine that in a real life project you'll probably have a lot of project elements in your workspace already, and we have one in this example as well. We were managing activities, and we were also managing a relation to an activity type. Now, a type was also a very good example of something that we would now configure as a reference element. But because we already have data on type, we don't want to reinvent the wheel or create this data again. So we've added the ability to go into the settings of your type element, or element called type, and when you go to the advanced tab and then scroll down a bit, you actually have the ability to convert your project element to a reference element. And once that's done, the element will be a reference type element, clearly indicated again by the visual identification. So the icon is now gray instead of colored, and we can see that the relation is a dotted line instead of that full line for project elements.
All right. So what about value lists then?
Right, so this is of course the use of reference elements, and when we compare that to a property with a value list, the added benefit of using a reference element of course is that people can actually edit this list and add new types to your reference elements. So this is a lot more flexible than your property with a value list, because for that property only a power user is able to expand or modify that list.
Right. Okay, so is this it for the reference part of libraries?
No, it's not. So I wanted to add another topic to the function of reference elements. So we're going to expand the model a bit more, because we also want to manage equipment items in this workspace. So first off, I want to start with building a new reference element called equipment item. And I'll quickly fill in the data. And the idea behind this equipment item, and I'll select an icon that fits like a hammer, is that this is information that's going to be used across multiple projects, and it'll probably be managed outside of Relatics. So we can very well imagine that this kind of information has a unique identifier, like a code that's generated outside of Relatics. So what I'll do before I move on is I'll just create a relation to equipment item, fill in the role, and put it on single, but you can put it on multi as well, as we saw in the previous example. And I'm going to add a property code to this as well. So we are able to manage that unique identifier in Relatics. But the idea is that when you create an element in Relatics, it will also receive a Relatics ID. And what we don't want is that we have both the unique Relatics ID and the unique identifier as a code in the workspace. So we can very well imagine that this is something that you want to take with you in the Relatics workspace as a unique identifier. So what I'll do is first I'll organize this model a bit so the code will be at the top. But we can very well imagine that you would receive an internal Excel list where these equipment items were already managed outside of Relatics and which are reused across multiple projects and that have a unique identifier. And we'll move to that list, and I want to, of course, I want to import that information into Relatics. So this allows me to import that information because I have an Excel list, of course. So I'll move to imports, and I'll upload my file, which I already have available. This is, of course, for the purpose of the webinar, so we don't have to create that entire list. But I want to tell you more about this update that we added to the import feature. So as you can see, we now have a wizard for importing information in Relatics. The first step is to upload your file, but the next step allows you to map the information you have in your Excel onto your model in Relatics. So you can select the elements that will receive the imported information, and if the column matches the information you have in your model, then Relatics will understand where you want to put it. So Relatics already filled out this information correctly, but we gave you the ability to select those elements yourself. So now you don't really have to worry about your Excel structure anymore. You can simply hand over that Excel file to Relatics and then use the mapping tool to select the correct element, and in the next step to select the correct properties based on the columns that are in Excel. And the cool feature about the cool addition about this feature is that you can also ignore certain columns if you don't need them in Relatics. Right now everything is as it should be, so I'll just hit next, and as we can see we're about to import 25 new elements, so let's do that. Elements have been created successfully, which of course we can inspect in the workspace. But if I click on that equipment item, I can see that the code has been filled in as well. And this is the unique identifier that we want to use instead of the Relatics ID in Relatics. So if it's a reference element, I have the ability to use that unique identifier. So for that, I'm going to the graph view. I can open up my settings of the element equipment item. And if I move to the advanced tab, I can simply enable the ability to use a natural key. This is my unique identifier. Next, I can select my code and I can update. And as we can see, the Relatics ID has been replaced with the unique identifier that I've added to this element. And if I look at my detail page, I can see that this icon indicates that we are using a natural key.
All right, Ruben. So what else do we have to keep in mind when it comes to reference elements?
Yeah, so we already said that reference elements were unique on a project. So they exist once in a project, and we want to keep that uniqueness correct. So what Relatics does is it enforces this uniqueness on both the display name of a reference element, but also on the natural key if applied to your element. We do offer a little bit of leniency, of course. So if you create an equipment item and you don't have that code yet, you'll receive an undefined on the natural key. So you can always add that code later if it's available.
All right, Ruben. So I understand there are two parts of libraries. One is the reference elements part we just discovered, but the other one is stenciling. What can you tell us about stenciling?
Yeah, so first off, because this is of course a lot of information and the library feature is very complex, I want to repeat the two types of data that you normally would find in the use of libraries. So first we were talking about reference data, which is unique and reused across project. But we want to talk about the second part, so about information that's stenciled or reused standardized data in your project, which can occur multiple times. So that's what we want to show you right now, is how to issue stenciling on your library feature. And for that, I'll move into my project workspace. So this is my second example project called Watergate Bridge. We'll move into the project, and of course we'll open my graph view again, and you'll see this, and I'll make it a little bit larger for, let's say this size, for my graph view. But what I first want to show you guys is that this is more of a larger example project that is already using the reference elements in their model. So what we did is we updated the graph view so users have the ability to enable and disable the visualization of reference elements in order to make your model a lot more readable. So by simply disabling and enabling, you can enable the reference elements or disable them so you only have a view of those core project elements in your workspace. But for this example, in the Watergate Bridge, we want to focus on the work package and work package activities. So basically a work breakdown structure. So this is the part of the model that we want to standardize further with our libraries feature. But before we do that, I'll move to my workspace. We already have a lot of data in this workspace, of course. But for work package, we don't have anything yet. So let me just start by creating a work package. Structure foundation or something. I'm just using some example data, so don't worry too much about what I'm filling in. But let's say I create a work package and I create some activities which are derived from the work package just for some data in this project. Imagine that this is how you would normally create data on your project. You're just managing it, you're creating new work packages, you're creating new activities, and of course this might take up a lot of time. The problem with this is that it creates inconsistencies, because if this data is reused on similar projects, somebody has to create those work packages again, and somebody has to create those activities again. And we want to avoid those inconsistencies, and we want to, of course, enforce a certain quality of the data. That's why we want to move on to standardizing, so we can ensure that better quality and consistency, and of course to make it a lot more efficient, because you can use standardized data sets which have been pre-built with work packages and activities, and that can be used in projects of a similar type. So we don't want to reinvent the wheel again. And let's start by standardizing some information about work packages and activities. So to do that, I want to start a new library workspace. So I move back to my overview of my workspaces, and before I move on, I want to draw your attention to our new workspace types. So at the top, you can see that we have project workspaces, You can have template workspaces where you can develop your templates, and as of this version, we'll have library workspaces. And Relatics will divide those up per type for ease of reference and for a lot cleaner view of your workspaces. So right now, as an administrator, I want to go to my workspace list and I want to create a new library workspace. So I'll hit new workspace, and again, you'll see those 3 new types. So you can decide at the start if you need a project workspace or a library workspace or a template workspace. And of course, we'll start with a library workspace. And I'll call that standard work breakdown structure library. But you can also choose multiple setups. So for this example, and for the sake of the webinar, we'll start with an empty library. But it is possible to start a library based on a project or an existing project workspace. And you can even start a library based on a template subscription. For now, we're going with an empty workspace. Let me create that workspace, and let me add myself as a user. And of course, a power user. Once I move back to my workspace overview, I can go to my library workspace types. I can enter my standard work breakdown structure library, and I'm going to start building a model. As I mentioned before, we want to standardize work packages with activities. So I'll create the model. So we start with work packages. Just select an icon, pick a color. And because we're working with a simple example, I won't add any properties for work packages. What I will do, of course, is add the activities. And the activities are a derived element of that work package. And again, let's look at a nice icon. And for activities, I'll add a description property. So we can add more text. So this, in a nutshell, is a very basic model, but this is the basic example we want to use to really explain to you how libraries and the library workspaces would work. And this is, of course, the same model that we have in our project workspace. So, of course, we need some data to manage in this workspace, and we're not going to create all the data by hand, so I'm just going to simply copy-paste that information from an existing Excel. Normally, this is, of course, information managed by a knowledge expert of that library. So you can imagine that it will take some time to get that data, but for now, we'll keep it simple. So I'll copy my work packages, place those in the workspace, and I'll use a My View to also copy some activities. So I'll take the first 4 work packages and fill them with some data. I don't need everything for my example. Like so. And the final one will be my 4th work package. So now I have some standard work packages, some standard activities ready to go. So this is basically my standardized data set that I want to use or share with my project workspaces. So we have our information, and the next step would be to make sure that this information is available to our projects. So I'll go to Output, and there we can find our new feature called Libraries, of course. I can open that up, and here I can add a library definition. Of course, I'm going to give it, well, let's just call it Work Packages with Activities. I can give this library definition a name, of course, but the important part is that I also select an entry element. And an entry element is what we call the main subject of your library, so and library definition in this case. So this is also the element that people will pick from or use the library on. So it's your main subject, just as you would use that on a report, for instance. The namespace is the name of the workspace, and I can simply hit Create, and we can start on our library definition. Right now, of course, it's empty, but for our more experienced users, this will probably look a bit familiar because it has the same type of query structure you would use in, let's say, the export feature and the report feature. And it has a similar syntax, and it uses a similar query. But before I start editing this query, I don't have to learn this syntax by heart, so don't worry. And of course, we'll be releasing help articles, and we'll be releasing tutorials to help you out with building a library, and we have our consultants available to lend you a hand. But to keep it easy, we can simply go to a My View of the work packages, and this is the information we want to take, so it's already ready to go. We can simply go to the settings of my view and copy the query for use in libraries. If I then move back to my library definition, open it up, edit my query, I can paste the query of that my view into this query and update, and as soon as I hit update, I get a nice preview of all the information that I want to make available for the projects. As you can see, it's not just the work packages, it's also the information from the activities. And I can inspect this, of course, and look at the data and see if it's complete and if it's ready for use. This was normally something, the query is normally something a power user would do, but the inspection of the data is something a knowledge expert, of course, can decide best, because these knowledge experts in the library are the ones that manage the data and know when the latest version is ready. Now, the last step before it's ready for use is I need to publish this information. And by hitting publish, I can give a name to this library. The date of today is automatically added, and I can even add a description if I want to, but for now we'll skip that. And I can hit publish, and as soon as I hit publish, I get an RCSL file ready to go on my computer.
All right, but Ruben, hold on, because you just published your library, but I can imagine different versions of libraries can exist in different points of time. So how do you handle this?
Yeah, of course, as I said before, the knowledge expert is the one that's going to manage this data in the library. And this is an ongoing process. You'll probably be managing that data and be releasing standardized data sets at set points in time. So you'll get multiple versions of those library definition. The idea is that we, of course, want the latest version for our projects. So we could imagine that these latest versions are stored on something like a SharePoint database for use outside of Relatics. And we can also imagine that you would store it on like the internet of an organization. But the cool thing about the RCSL file is that it's actually a file that contains an open XML format. So if you have the proper technical background, you could actually edit, modify, and expand your RCSL file without working in Relatics, or maybe even working in third-party applications. We could even imagine that if you have these standardized data sets, you might want to share them between organizations. So we'll maybe see clients sharing standardized data sets as RCSL files with contractors. Or we'll maybe see government organizations sharing those standardized data sets with smaller municipalities.
Right, okay, so that's clear. So now we have a good idea of how to create a library. What would be the next step?
Yeah. So the next step, of course, is to make this available to the users in our project. So I'll go back to my example project, which was Watergate Bridge, and we'll enter the project. And as a power user, I'm able to go to my settings, go to libraries, of course, and we can already see that a few libraries were included. We'll get back to that later. We can include a library. And here we again see that handy new tool that we saw with the import feature. So we have a kind of a wizard for setting up your RCSL file or making it available for the project. We can then simply upload the file of the RCSL of the library, and immediately you'll see some information to tell you what the contents of this RCSL are. I can hit next. And then we see the same mapper that we saw in the import feature. So you have the ability to select the elements that are going to use the information that is in the RCSL file. Now, if the names match, then Relatics will again assume that you'd want work package on work package and activity on activity, but you still have the ability to select your own elements if your model is not completely similar to that of the library. This is not a requirement. So you can select the element. Once you're satisfied with the selections, you can hit next, and then you can select those fields per property again. So you can look at the information that's in the RCSL and then select the correct properties. And if you choose, you can ignore certain fields as well. Once you're satisfied, the power user can hit include. The library will be included to the workspace, and it will be made available to the end users.
End users, you say. So wait, let's take a step back.
Yeah.
Because there are different rules on the project. How does that work for different rules in organizations or on projects?
Yeah, again, I realize this is a lot of steps and a lot of information, so I'll give a quick resume or a quick review of what we did, quick summary. At the start, I started with creating a new library workspace. If you want to create a workspace, that is something the administrator will do. So an administrator can create a library workspace, environment administrator, I might add. But once I've created that library workspace, as my example, and I go into the library, it's the power user of the library that can set up the model that needs to be managed. The power user is also the one, of course, that invites the users into the library. And the power user is the person that creates the library definitions. The knowledge expert, who is basically an end user in the library workspace, is the person that is going to manage the actual data. So that's the person that's going to create the work packages, create the activities, and finalize all the information so it's ready for publishing. The knowledge expert or end user is also the person that's going to release or publish that library definition. So once the library definition has been built by the power user with a query, the publish option can actually be done by the end user or the knowledge expert. Once the information has been published, we go back to our project, which wants to include the new library, and that's something that's done by the power user. So the power user can go to the settings and can then upload that library into the project workspace, and once that's done, we enter the final step in which end users can actually start working with that library data in the workspace.
Right, that's clear. So I would say let's go back to the end user.
All right, so from the viewpoint of an end user, we want to, of course, show how you can use that data, that standardized data set that's being managed on the project. As you might recall, we selected the entry element work package, so it's safe to assume that we want to navigate to our overview of work packages, because that's our main subject. And once we arrive there, we can actually see that we have the ability to open up our library drawer, as we call it. Now, the idea behind this library drawer is that here you will find all the published libraries that were included in this workspace. So here we can see on this tab the actual library that we just included. Now you can imagine, because the data set will be managed and more versions will release, is that you'll have multiple tabs of a same subject. For now we have one, but it is possible to have multiple libraries on that same subject. Once we click open that library, we'll see what we call stencils. So rows of that information. In this case, each row represents a work package, and that's what we call a stencil. And once we click on one of those stencils, we'll see a preview again with the information that we will be stenciling once we use this feature. As soon as I'm comfortable with my decision of my stencil, I can simply click, drag onto the ghost row of my overview, and Relatics will create that work package and will create the activities which were a part of that work package as well. I just used a single one, but you can, of course, use multiple with Shift and click and drag them onto the ghost row. I can even use Control, maybe cherry pick a few stencils and drop them in between. And of course, again, all the information will be stenciled immediately. So the work packages, but also the activities that were a part of that library. And once I did that, the usage count comes into effect, and the usage count basically tells me how many times a certain element has been stenciled, or how many times a certain stencil has been used in this project. So I can see that I've stenciled this work package twice, or once, or twice. And once I click on that information to inspect if everything was stenciled correctly, if I am on the detail page of that information, I can actually open up the history tab, and I can see that this information was created from a stencil. So in accordance with traceability on all this information, you can now see that this information originated from a library stencil. We also have a search option available in the library drawer. So if, for example, you have a library with a long list of stencils, you'll be able to search for certain work packages, or maybe another project element in your case. We can even disable and enable certain stencils in this library. So as a user, I can select a certain row and I can disable a stencil. So if you're satisfied with how many times a work package has been stenciled, you can disable it for use. Don't worry, you can enable it again if you need it, just by hitting the same button. And I just want to repeat the concept behind this. So at the start, we were talking about reference elements, which are unique with a single occurrence to refer to in the project. The second part, which is what we're talking about now, is the stencil data that can be added multiple times to the project and fine-tuned based on your project needs.
Right, that's clear. So I think that looks great for simpler structures. But earlier you mentioned we can make it more complex. Can you also show us an example of that?
Yeah, of course. So this is, of course, it's a simple example with just work packages and activities, just to get you up to speed on the functionalities and on how the feature works. But of course, we want to show you more complex libraries as well, because you can make that query as complex as you want, depending, of course, on the model that you're using. It's not just meant for single elements. It's really meant for stenciling an entry element with an entire cloud or network of data surrounding it, with all relations and properties that you want to standardize and publish to your workspace. So what we did is we already added some libraries to this workspace with a few more advanced examples. So we'll dive into those right now. I'll move to systems. As you can imagine, a lot of projects have a system breakdown structure, and we already have a system breakdown structure available here, but we want to add more decompositions to this workspace. We basically want to stencil hierarchies. That's why we have the ability to open the library drawer and inspect the systems library that we added to this workspace. And again, this works the same way as with the simple example, only now we can see in the preview that you can actually stencil an entire system decomposition. So simply by adding those to my tree view, I'm adding entire decompositions to my workspace. So just by clicking and dragging all those decompositions, I have them in my workspace. I can even take a decomposition and just click and drag it onto a lower level. So it doesn't have to be at the root level. I can just add it to a lower level as well. So I can actually combine multiple decompositions into an entire breakdown structure. Now that's one advanced example. We have another, which is very complex. We want to stencil requirements, but we don't want to stencil a list of just the element requirements. No, we want to have that entire network surrounding requirements. So I go to my overview of requirements. Again, you can see that there are a lot of requirements already made available in the workspace, but these are project-specific requirements. And now I want to have some standard requirements from my library, and I want to add them into the workspace. So as you can see, we have some requirements available, and in the preview we can see that it's not just the element, it's also the properties, it's a relation to discipline, it's even standard risks, standard control measures, and all the information surrounding that requirement. And another handy feature is that somebody used categories in this library. So this allows me to scroll through the different types of requirements, like aspect requirements, functional requirements, which of course makes it an easier structure to manage for the users and to simply find the correct requirements they want to stencil. So let's take, let's say 4 requirements, and then put them on my overview. And again, if I inspect these requirements, it's not just the elements, it's not just the properties, it's the standard risks as well, and it's the standard control measures that were stenciled as well. So you can make it as complex as you want. Now I do want to zoom in on an addition to this stencil, because it's not just the requirements with the standard risks. This stencil also had a relation to a reference element. Now in this project we had a reference element right here called discipline. Now as I mentioned before, we want to enforce uniqueness on those reference elements. So what the stencil does, it stencils the relation to the discipline, but it doesn't stencil the exact reference element because we want to enforce that uniqueness. That's why we would already have those reference elements in our workspace, as you would normally import them at the start of your project. But don't worry, you can always, of course, manually add a new discipline if you need it for stenciling, as long as it's unique, of course. And then once we stencil that information and I check out my requirement, I can see that it received that relation to the reference element discipline.
All right, thank you, Ruben. Is this all for the stenciling part?
No. I think one of the coolest features, or one of the coolest additions in my eyes to the library feature is something that we still have to show. So what I just did is, of course, I stenciled a few system breakdown structures, and I stenciled a few requirements. Now, because we have a library with requirements that are included in this workspace, and we have a library with systems that's been included in this workspace, we can also include recommendations for relations you would standardize between systems and requirements. Now, I want to show you how this works. So let's look at a random system. Let's say the project member stenciled this system and also stenciled some requirements from the library, but in the library these systems and requirements have relations. So what the project member does, he or she starts to relate requirements to that system, but right now Relatics understands that because both the system and the requirement were stenciled, it can give you recommendations of standard relations you could add to this system. So these are requirements that are in the workspace, but have a relation in the library, and then Relatics will recommend those requirements as a relation. Now, I was scrolling through the entire list, but you can actually click on the icon and get a subset of those recommendations, and then simply add those relations like that. And this works the other way around as well. So if I move to my requirement and I want to relate systems to this requirement, I can open up the relation, I can go to my list, and as I can see, there are 12 library recommendations ready to be related. And instead of scrolling through my entire list, I can simply select my subset and then select the systems that I want to make sure that I have the complete standardized data set ready for use in my projects.
Oh, thank you, Ruben. So this was a lot of information. Can you tell us, I think you mentioned before, but how our viewers can get support setting this up?
Yeah, again, it's a lot of information, we know, but of course we want to help you with setting up your ideal library feature for your environment. So we'll be releasing help articles for all the functionalities. We'll be releasing a tutorial which will take you through setting up a library step by step. And we'll even release design patterns, which give you examples of real-life situations in which libraries can be issued. And we have our consultants ready to lend a hand to set up your perfect library.
All right. Thank you, Ruben, for walking us through libraries. Right, it was a lot of information, and I can imagine our viewers can't wait to play with this. Luckily, they don't have to wait too long because both the release notes and the new version of the software will be available on very short notice. For now, thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.